of the term at the AA, and more specifically, the first of a series of, I think, 4 lectures configured by Schumann as a series of curators and critics. I leave it to Mark to consider how he fits in to these categories. It's a very great pleasure to welcome, and I stress welcome back, Mark Pimlott to give a paper this evening, because I may be wrong, but I think he hasn't actually given an evening lecture since he left. If not saying that's the last time I come through this door, then something very like it in the mid-early 90s. Now, it's a pleasure in 2 senses. One is, I'm afraid I haven't myself been able to get hold of the book till this afternoon. And so what I say is based on reading the introduction, but I'm a very good reader. And the book promises an analysis which I think is extremely interesting and sort of, if plausible and if right, answers a lot of questions which historians and theorists of architecture have often asked themselves, which essentially is, what happens with the introduction of modernism in America? What makes it so very different? And people give a whole range of answers. Some people answer, for example, that in a sense the introduction of modernism in America came largely through photography in the form of the initial exhibition by Hitchcock and whatever his name is, Johnson. And, it's a kind of real issue. This book proposes a kind of startling kind of answer, one which exists in a way not only at the level of architectural history, but in a sense more generally at a kind of anthropological level, at the level of a basic kind of practice of culture within America, which in particular means this, that in a sense the carving out, the domestication of American wilderness converted the territory of America into something which was always already kind of internal, as if there was no normal break, normal transition from wilderness to architecture to an interior, as if somehow the expansion of America interiorized architectural design, such that, and it comes to bear on what he calls in here the introduction, a childhood kind of memory, as to why these external spaces seemed, in this child's or this ex-child's sensibility, so akin to internal spaces. And that's what, in a sense, Mark will speak about this evening. Now, looking around the audience, there are some people who are currently studying at the AA, but I noticed that there are also a number of faces from the earlier 90s when Mark was teaching here. The biographical notes tell you in rather kind of blunt outline that he studied at McGill University, Montreal, and the AA, and the visual arts at Goldsmiths. But what it doesn't tell you is really that he was a very influential teacher here. His unit was either popular or unpopular because of its rigorous dedication to architecture, while at the same time was extremely interested in the relationship between contemporary architectural design and artistic kind of forms. Mark Pimlott would be my proposal as the only person who would be able to discuss the idea of minimalism, not only in the fine arts, but in architecture. In architecture, as you know, minimalism normally just means everything's white and everything else is hidden in a cupboard. But the idea of a more kind of rigorous and theoretical-based minimalism was left to Mark to kind of teach while he was here. So it's, for those of us who kind of recall the teaching, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome him back, especially to begin the year of these lectures. Mark, welcome.
Mark, thank you very, very much. That's a very touching and generous introduction. And I'd have to say it's a real pleasure to be back at the AA. It's been a long time, probably too long, but I have been doing things since then. Mark is quite right in saying that the subject of this lecture tonight emerges from a perception that came from childhood, where I understood, or I told myself I understood, that the place I was in front of a suburban dwelling next to a motorway, next to a railway line, next to an international airport, was not just the place I was in, but it was somehow other places as well. And it is a quality germane to the North American urban space that somehow places are all equivalent. And this is something that I kept within me for a long time. I had the good fortune of being raised in Montreal, which at the time was undergoing enormous expansion, but modernization, let's put it that way. And in the city, there are spaces that were proposed, which were actualized versions of utopian ideas, things which had probably been part of the American idea for a very long time, but which had not been articulated, and found their articulation there. So I was fortunate in a way to be raised in both a banal condition and a highly self-conscious, sophisticated one at the same time. The thesis of my thesis, if you will, which I'm going to try to describe to you tonight, briefly, is that the continuous interiors which characterize modern public, well, what we call public space, the modern public interior, continuous in the sense that it rambles, it goes on, it connects, it goes through levels, it extends over domains far beyond those of specific interiors that we can identify. Those interiors which are filled with the representations of publicity, which could be said to be subject to the condition of publicity. These interiors, common to the airport, the shopping mall, the museum, and countless others, transport interchanges, well, the airport's part of that. Oh my God, clean the air filter. You really got to take care of these things here. It's just like the AA in the old days, except we used to have slides sticking in the projector. Now we have notices. It's very good. Those interiors are related, I believe, to the ideas and execution, the realization of the territorialization and urbanization of the American West. This is probably on the outside of far-fetched notion, but it always seemed to me that the way that Americans thought of space was somehow different from the way Europeans thought of space. The European method had to do with specificity and acknowledgement of difference and, well, specialness in a sense. And that specialness is, of course, built into the European prototype of the Roman city and how it was laid out and imagined, a city that would be made really from the auspices that were found by an ogre who would look at a site and say, well, it's propitious to put it here, and this is the main axis, and this is the minor axis, and this is where the temple should be, and so on. That despite the repeating form of such cities, Roman cities, their precise location and the precise disposition of monuments and gates would be very particular to the site, and there would be a great significance to the act of carving out a space from the world in order to make the city. In the North American version of this, the American version of it, I'll put it quite clearly, there's a profound difference. Now, in the first settlements in America, there was an observation of absolutely European procedures. The form, the grid, in this case, was an extension of Roman procedures, but you could see it all over the world in Western colonializations of places. A grid would always be laid out, and that would form the city. But there's always a distinction between the space within and the space without. And that space without would have a characteristic of being somehow other. Of course, it did contain the other. It was the space of panic, for example, the space of the wilderness, of danger. And the interior of the city, the templum, if you will, was a clearing made for the occupation of people. But there is something in that which is also very important, that there is a kind of self and another written into the script of this urbanization. Now, as it turns out, in the American experience, after years of being colonial subjects, it was quite clear Americans had a very particular character, a desire for movement, they had a wanderlust, if you will, a desire to go to new places, and the desire to possess land, and a desire to be free. I think Thomas Jefferson acknowledged that the American beast was quite different from the European beast. There was a kind of transformation that had taken place somehow along the way, not only as a resistance to the difficulties of being taxed by the British, but actually there was a completely different character, completely different set of desires, and a desire for independence, not only of nationhood, but of spirit. And that following the American War of Independence, Jefferson devised a scheme acknowledging the Americans' desire to move, which would be a scheme for the division of land in territories as yet unknown. And this scheme, the Ordnance Plan, was a device which would enable and assist surveying. It would allow entire territories, the nature of which were unknown, to be conceptualized, if you will, and then occupied at some further date. It was a scheme which would be followed as the pattern of land ownership, as the pattern of surveying, and as a pattern of the urban form in the future. And it's incredibly significant, and actually perhaps the most significant characteristic of the American urbanized territory. There was an enormous space beyond the eastern colonies to move into. First of all, part of the Constitution was, or part of the idea was that if you moved into a space which was, which was purchased from the Indians, or at that time purchased from the Indians, then indeed this space would become a state if you had a certain number of people. But Jefferson commissioned a famous Lewis and Clark expedition to find out what that space was about, which was basically a piece of a discovery and a piece of propaganda to report on natural phenomena, geological formations, the possibility of extraction of wealth from the land, and really to find out about what the mysteries of the place were. But it was really not until the middle of the 1800s, later 1860s in fact, that the project of transforming the American West from a territory which existed purely in the imagination into a territory which could be perceived, imagined, desired, came through the photographs that were associated with the great surveys, geological surveys, army surveys, and railway surveys, which looked at the American land, which was not yet really entirely American land at all, but occupied by indigenous peoples, and made photographs of it. There were two kinds of photographs. Basically, the surveys were intended to be scientific expeditions, but there was a tendency among one type of photographer to romanticize the West, in a way capitalize on its sublime qualities, and there are other kinds of photographs which acknowledged its distinct, specific otherness. This first group of photographs, I suppose a paradigm is represented best by Carlton Watkins, this photograph of the Yosemite Valley. Watkins's photographs of the Yosemite were really photographs of an American sublime. And the exposition of these photographs in New York and across America it's a good ringtone, that one. Those photographs displayed really popularized the idea that the West could be in fact occupied. There were all sorts of assistant motifs which were directed at getting people to occupy these spaces, but there was a natural desire for Americans to continuously move west, usurping the people who were there. But this sublime quality was very significant, because if Eden was in fact in America, that meant that America was somehow touched by God. And this notion that, in fact, it was a state, this is a revolutionary state. Jefferson pictured it as a state of emancipated individuals. It's an extraordinary idea. Individuals who are able to manifest, realize their own desires through the ownership, transformation of land, who are able to project themselves as individuals over a landscape. The grid offered by the land ordinance did that conceptually. As individuals, that conceptualization was supposed to be continuously enacted. And here was an additional authorization, a kind of sacred authorization, which took that landscape and said, it's God's landscape and it's yours too. This is an important motif which comes up again and again in American urbanization. The other paradigm was represented perhaps best by the photographer Timothy O'Sullivan, whose photographs had quite a different response to the West. We must remember that the spaces were enormous, far beyond anything that could be discovered in Europe. I think the only space in continental Europe, well, it's actually in Asia. The German soldiers discovered in their invasions of the Russian steppes a kind of acute paranoia, if you will, in confrontation with the immensity of it, which seemed to be so foreign, so other. And I think O'Sullivan's photographs best represent a kind of meeting with the landscape and a meeting with the space of the other, where the photographer has his part and the landscape and the other has his. And these two things come together, quite opposite to the attitude of Watkins, which says that view is to be possessed. Our desires are projected upon it, it becomes ours. I said earlier that there were motifs which assisted this idea along. Part of them were legislative, some of them were ideological. The idea of manifest destiny is one that says, as I've stated before, that somehow that territory is rightfully the space of Americans, and I don't mean indigenous Americans, I mean Western Americans. It's their right to occupy that space and to fulfill themselves, to realize themselves, and that realization of themselves is a realization of their place in the whole picture of creation. And the other is enacted in the Homestead Act. This, by the way, is a division of plots of land as provided for in Jefferson's Land Ordinance, which divided, as I said before, not only whole territories into grids, but it was a system which actually came right down to the dimensions of building materials. It was a complete system, in a way, which could be used. It was a device. And here we see it in the making of a township, that basic unit which would describe very large plots of land. Here you see how they're supposed to be cultivated by a plow, which each would have a number, and one of the numbers would be set aside for an educational institution, the only public facility that exists in the notion of an American urban entity, if you will. Each of these other rather large plots of land were intended for individual cultivation. That is, if you could settle the land, put a homestead upon it, a farm, a house, and work the land, then you were entitled to own it at a preferred rate. And this idea, this kind of deal, if you will, special sale deal on land in the middle of nowhere, was very, very appealing to a populace that not only consisted now, this is in the 1860s, of Americans who just wanted to move, to those Americans who were brand new, coming from Europe and wanting to start life anew with rather utopian ideas in their head. I suppose the engine for this was constantly the presence of this Edenic promise. A promise of a promise. Well, yes, it was Edenic. It meant that somehow the whole project was legitimated under God. And in a way, each piece of that American landscape, no matter how poor or how rich, how individualistic, was at once just another bit of grid, but at the same time a piece of Eden. And this motif of a plot of land which could be nowhere and everywhere at the same time, enriched with the promise of paradise, if you will, and at the same time a piece of land where somebody could realize their own ambitions, this underpins the entire American urban enterprise. And that enterprise was tested for being, despite its apparent poverty. Here's, again, a homestead in the middle of nowhere. You can see that the cultivation of land is a fantastic idea, but in some circumstances, an extremely improbable idea indeed. Dusty plains offering no possibility of sustenance still compelled people to move out and occupy land in kind of elemental ways which repeated and repeated in precisely the same format everywhere. The grid offered a very interesting characteristic to the American territory, or American urbanized, territorialized territory. There was a kind of equivalence where each piece of land was very much like the next, where each piece of land sustained the desires of individuals, where each piece of land was essentially in competition with the next. First of all, each piece of land was in competition with the very, very real space without, which was indeed the space of the other, which they had to defend themselves against. But in the end, these spaces were just next to each other, everybody living out their dream in contrast. This is a view, a completely virtual view of a piece of the American West generated by a Google Earth, but you get a sense of the apparent infinity of all this. It does, if you take a little aerial Google trip, which I recommend you do, just go on forever. And the fact that it does go on forever is married very, very well to the grid, which can also go on forever, ever, indifferent to difference, and always supportive of the basic facts. The fact is that the American land and supported the American city. the American city came out in precisely the same shapes, in the same format, the same essential characteristics as this American landscape, in that each element was independent, autonomous, if you will. They were linked to each other by infrastructure, by the space between each of these parts of this grid. But each bit was a fragment, and the fragments came together to form this overall form. And here is a township, a whole region filled with either imaginary or indeed planned plots of land, townships, which exist in happy coexistence with each other. You'll note that there is absolutely no hierarchy within this plan. It's all equivalent. Everything's the same. But everything is different, of course, because it all is done by individuals. When these things are made into towns, they take on these kinds of forms. You notice that hierarchy, or lack of it, is inherent in this view. I think this is in Nebraska. And the view, which is a panorama, continues. There are houses, or churches, or stores on any block. It doesn't really matter. Perhaps eventually there are logical connections or hierarchies which emerge. But essentially it's proposed as being non-hierarchical, that everything is adjacent to each other, that everything is essentially antagonistic to each other. There's a kind of principle of antagonistic adjacencies. Eventually, this landscape is given a kind of hierarchy by the presence of the railway. The railway, of course, taking advantage of all those wonderful photographs of the survey to know what they're doing. But the railway eventually first stretches from east to west, and then between settlement and settlement, until you get a kind of network, an urban order, which starts, or a regional order, if you will, which starts to appear. This is perhaps represented best in this map of Chicago, which shows the property of the Central Illinois Railway Company. And the grid, as you can see, is present there, but you will also note the presence of small settlements which are along a line. It turned out, of course, that the railway companies knew a good thing when they saw it, and noting that it was very, very difficult to cultivate a huge grid of land, bought up lots of territories around the lines it was planning to make, and decided that there will be towns along there to distribute people to make money. The railway companies and their shareholders made a lot of money from this speculative development, because they're guaranteed there will be a town at every stop with all the proper facilities of each town. But the as you can see, this pattern doesn't just exist on the level of a plot of land or the arrangement of a township, but on whole regions and then in cities themselves. There's a very large gap in here. The book, which this lecture is modeled on, is immensely, the story is immensely complicated. There are many narratives which fill in and illustrate the development of this idea as it's enacted. One of the very important contributing notions is this idea of the company town. I'll just briefly explain it. As cities grew in size, and they did very rapidly because of immigration and burgeoning industrialization, the railway, which was a way of conveying goods simply from one part of the territory to the other, eventually became a way of distributing all the contents of the city over its entire territory. So the city itself became dispersed, if you will, distributed over large regions. And that map I showed you before, with lines coming out of Chicago, showed that indeed the city existed not just as an urban center, but as a series of minor centers. Now these minor centers could perhaps be controlled. And what I mean by controlled is that the laborers, or the people who lived in them, could be overseen, that their lives could be determined in particular ways. This is the map of Pullman. Pullman was an industrialist who produced railway carriages, ultimately. And he was both a reformer and somebody who wanted to make his company perform efficiently. His idea was to make a town all of his own, which would, of course, bear his own name. And that town would have all the facilities necessary, not only for the manufacture of their products, but for the housing of employees and for their general well-being, places of recreation, places of consumption, and so on. In fact, every aspect of the life of a worker of Pullman was drawn into the system that the town operated. It ran the police, it ran all the schools, it ran the churches, it ran the arcade, and of course it ran the business, and you rented your property from Mr. Pullman. So in a sense, it's a very extreme example of what ultimately became another characteristic of the American landscape, which was that in the reality of a modern, essentially metropolitan capitalist economy, that people just couldn't be out on a farm realizing their connection with God. They had to work. But they also desired to be free in the way that Jefferson had promised. And a kind of contract, I suppose, ended up being drawn between Americans and the corporations who employed them, where there's a kind of exchange between the daily life, or the image of the daily life one led, and the way one conducted one's work. That there was a kind of equivalence, just like in the plan, of work and private life. I have this as an illustration of the arcade in the town of Pullman. And it's just as there were company towns, there were other fantasies operating in American urban life. This is Frederick Law Olmsted's plan for Riverside. Olmsted was the planner of Central Park. And this is a wealthy suburb in the northern part of Chicago, which north and west, which was designed to erase all notions of the grid and all notions that, in fact, one was part of an urbanized system at all, but offered plots of land in a kind of Edenic settings, which looked very much like this other development, which was in New Jersey, built 30 years earlier, which had this as an idea, a very pervasive idea. But the township of Riverside was connected, of course, quite keenly, smartly by a railway line to the center. Olmsted's, of course, was famous for plan for New York, but also was essential character in preserving Yosemite, which, of course, was photographed by Carlton Watkins as the first national park in America. In other words, that bit of Eden would always be preserved forever. And, of course, Central Park as well, with its amazing network of paths and open fields, lakes, and roads ingeniously buried in the whole landscape, was meant to be, based on the original landscape was placed on, a kind of re-evocation of this nature, this sublime nature, this God-blessed nature that America was actually part of. And we come to a characteristic of the American city, which is, again, important to describe. It wasn't just a machine producing plots of land and places for people to be. It was actually a machine which gathered ideas to itself, ideas which legitimated it. You could say that manifest destiny, that notion that it's God's country, was an idea that had to be grafted on to the reality of populating the vast spaces of the American West. And it was things like Central Park, which, and its quotation of nature, if you will, in the middle of the city, which legitimated the increasingly complex problem of managing the growth of metropole. This is a plan made at the beginning of the 20th century by Daniel Burnham for the city of Chicago, called the Commercial Club Plan, or the Chicago Plan more properly, which imagined the mess of Chicago as it was, organized on a grid, roped into a kind of almost Parisian vision of diagonal streets and significant monuments. These were drawn over the existing plan and very, very cleverly worked out to take advantage of all the existing natural infrastructures that were there to make the city work as efficiently as possible, not just as a grid, but as a city that actually could have shortcuts in the manner of Haussmann's plan, but also a city, crucially, with an additional layer of representation, which was essentially European, imported, superimposed on the plan, which had monuments and classicism and stories of other places, places that weren't America. And this external imagery was used in order to not only legitimate the American city as a kind of noble project, which it hadn't been, it had just been, well, it had been ennobled by Jeffersonian ideology, but it hadn't been ennobled in a way that Americans increasingly felt it had to be, you know, a nation among other nations. This was a way of the American city of becoming legit. And interestingly, all the representations were appropriated by, and paid for in this case, by those people who had all the money. So in other words, the great industrialists were the people who paid for the plan, were the people who were housed in the big buildings, whose names were given to the institutions, which were designed to effect a sense of awe, civic responsibility in those denizens of the ordinary bits. And it's interesting that the American grid and this supposedly non-hierarchical, everything equivalent city could accept this superimposition. But I suppose it was necessary to impose a kind of order. And I think you'll find that the development of American space and ultimately the interior, which I'm really going to get to, is necessarily built on an idea of hierarchy and obedience. The models that they were borrowed from, the Americans borrowed from, were of course from Europe, not only neoclassicism, but the language of the arcade, which of course is turned into a kind of super scale thing by the Crystal Palace, which is also heavily borrowed from, which of course has the convenient characteristic common to the grid of containing everything. And still within this principle of things being next to each other, antagonistic to each other, remained as the real engine of growth of American towns. This is a picture of Chicago, again, at the turn of the 20th century, looking a bit of a mess. But I think what you might appreciate is that, well, first of all, the great accumulation of very, very large buildings of rather generic design next to each other. The space of the street, which is a chaotic place for the movement of materials, not exactly a public plaza this, but the middle of Chicago nevertheless. And the interesting phenomenon of buildings starting to represent things. This is actually a public building, the Auditorium building in New York, but it was the habit of American buildings owned by large industrialists to take on the format of palazzi, for example, Florentine palazzi, in order to express, to quote and to express, quite literally, their economic power. The interior of such buildings were usually filled with fantastic devices. In fact, it was the interior constantly which expressed itself and set up worlds of fantasy, one next to the other, opposite to each other. This affected all kinds of buildings, from the office building to theaters to department stores. And each of these interiors, of course, was in competition to each other. The architecture on the outside was, in a way, just reduced to a sign. The interior started being conceived as being something that could be larger and larger, more encyclopedic, more definitive, and in a way, a place which would put the world away. This is also a characteristic of the grid as it was conceived by Jefferson. The grid, of course, presumes that there's nothing else in existence, that the other space doesn't really exist at all, that all is necessary is to do is just to project a kind of ego over a whole world, and that's fine. In a sense, the egos end up being limited to the size of a plot of land. This, of course, Hugh Ferris's interpretation of the 1910 or 1912, I have to be corrected, zoning law in New York in its early stages, which isn't architecture, it's just the maximum volume that can be occupied. And these interiors, which are essentially places of fantasy, all in competition with each other, as I've described them before. Either places to relax, places to consume entertainment, places to consume goods. This pattern really goes unbroken until the Depression. This, of course, is the Rockefeller Center, which was built by virtue of the fact that labor was extremely cheap during the Depression. And it is interesting in a couple of ways. First of all, because it is essentially a much more ambitious version of the one plot, one development idea. It suggests a whole piece of the city over several plots of land, which maintain quite plausibly the fantasy of a city on its own. And of course it's connected all internally, which brings one to the notion, or a prototype at least, for the continuous interior. But I suppose at this time all sorts of other interesting things are happening. The Depression, of course, brings a kind of conscience to the development of America. A conscience in a sense of urgency, that really the situation as it exists, with overcrowded cities, impoverished homesteads, and really no real hierarchical infrastructure in place, means that things have to be revised, that the ideology, in fact, has to be revised. And of course, Roosevelt is famous for his almost not nearly socialist view of things. But what's interesting is that just before the war, in the light of the Depression, a new thought is concerned about, comes into being about the American city and about the American territory, which ultimately has a very profound effect on the American interior, in that the regions are not just things to be occupied or used as they were by companies in the past or by the railways for speculative exploitation, but are rather places where people live, where they want to live, and which should be revitalized. In other words, the beginning of regional planning starts in the United States. How would that be affected? Well, by the use of motorways and a new idea about distribution of urban functions. In the World's Fair in 1938, this regional city countryside is proposed as a kind of vision of modern architecture and modern technology, which can deliver a kind of regional city. There are fancy films. This is one produced by Norman Bell Geddes, which fantasizes about a kind of urban rural complex which is made up of motorways, nice skyscrapers, and well, not shopping malls because they don't exist yet, but certainly freeways which are able to traverse the very, very large territory with no problem at all. The first products of regional thinking, which are actually coming in the 1930s, are new town developments, green belt developments, which are worked on by very important people such as Lewis Mumford and others, which suggests that there's a new type of urbanism which can be actually linked to regional infrastructures, which are distributed logically across the American territory in close relation to natural resources which can be exploited for things like energy and so on. There's a kind of counter view which is proposed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which is very much more Jeffersonian in spirit, which says just give the people a car and let them get on with the rest. His project for Broadacre City, in fact, is the kind of nadir, if you will, of a Jeffersonian plan. But what he proposes is very interesting, and what Wright foresees is very interesting, is that at the nodes of these infrastructural connections, it's necessary for people to have places to shop. And indeed, the plan that Roosevelt envisaged for America to be resumed, well, for America, which couldn't be anticipated in a way as being successful as it was for a kind of mobilized, consuming American public. And of course, the war changed, the Second World War this is, 1939 to 1945. The Americans conducted from late 1941 to 1945, turned Americans' fortunes completely. America became a kind of a manufacturing place for world armaments, and made a lot of money, and after the war had to turn its industrial plant, which had grown something like fivefold over the course of 5 years, to the purposes of something else. And it decided that consumer objects were going to be that purpose. Essentially, a whole new idea of American life emerged. Legislation was ensured that people could own their own homes, could have their own cars, could buy the consumer goods that had to be produced in order to keep the industrial plant going, in order to live. And of course, a lot of those goods were going to Europe, and with money offered by the Marshall Plan. But here's a picture of a typical American household of 1951, photographed with all the goods that they would consume in 1 year. There's a lot of meat in there. That's why Americans grow to be so big and strong. The context for at the time was your typical main street. This is a main street which is quoted both by Peter Blake, a kind of critic of American slovenly urbanity and its wastage, and by Robert Venturi, who celebrates its representations in that public space, the one that remains from all the interior representations, the street. The consequences of this in the urban scene were quite dramatic. Houses had to be produced in huge numbers, and they were produced in factory-like ways which were consistent with the production that was going on in the factories themselves. Suburbs everywhere, most of them subject to wild speculation in the most hopeless places, but there was a degree of regional planning. And of course, the other great feature of that was enabled by all the money that came into the United States following the war was the construction of regional infrastructures, motorways, which were very, very expensive indeed, but became an absolute necessity for connecting people between the cities that they worked in and the houses that they lived in. And so the kind of equivalence of the house to landscape to city became drawn in spaces such as these. These are the lovely photographs of Stephen Shaw, who which describe a kind of non-place, if you will, where everything's kind of available, everything's equivalent, the car roams over it all, and somehow places of work, places of leisure, and places of dwelling are woven in between. The consequences directly for cities, you could say, was rather disastrous. You had forms, this is Houston, which Mark and I discussed earlier today, where everything was possible to be adjacent to everything else. Places which were not economically sustainable ended up being as residue spots for parking, but indeed you could have slum next to office building, next to concert hall, next to shopping mall. Absolutely no problem at all. What the regional development, dependent on the highway, actually managed to institute, really quite opposite to the city, which was this wasteland in comparison, was a kind of structure. A structure with a bit of a dream attached to it as well. The dream being, of course, the residue of all that Edenic hopefulness, mythologized now in American westerns and in American advertising. This is Yosemite, still the kind of the engine room, if you will, of the American dream. And its form finds itself in residual utterances, if you will, in the suburbs. And this is, in fact, a view from my very own home, which is my own little piece, or was our own little piece of Eden. Fortunately, Eden was connected to other things via motorways, and at the junctions of those motorways, and this is roads which lead to those motorways. Fortunately, at the junctions of those motorways, there was a new invention, the mall. The mall comes out of this I'm probably going way over, sorry. The mall comes out of this new urban condition, an urban condition which is distributed over enormous areas, and it actually works by virtue of the motor car. It suggests, this is Victor Gruen's plan for mallification of Fort Worth, Texas. It suggests that actually everything can be a mall, that the mall can absorb everything. It's very, very interesting that these early schemes, which were the prototypes of the enclosed shopping malls that he became famous for, are in fact the first acts at actually blurring public space with privately owned commercialized space, which has effects of the interior and of the exterior all at once. The exterior is kind of internalized, subject to things like handy shop directories in the middle of Main Street, things which we start to find in the interiors of malls themselves. The malls proper existed at opportune points of infrastructural meeting, and they gathered, there were crossings and motorways, things like that, and placed to maximize their markets, the number of people that come to them. This is the Southdale Mall, really the first internalized air-conditioned shopping mall, which is a very, very interesting place. Quite apart from its location, it proposes an interior which pretends to be at once an exterior by virtue of the placement of outdoorsy things like trees and pots and little monuments, and at the same time distinctly corporate, looking very, very much like some sort of office building interior that one might have worked in at the time. These environments too are proposed as places where public life can actually take place. There's an annual orchestra, performance of the Minneapolis State Orchestra in the shopping center. And this was part of an idea that indeed this is, the shopping mall is the city. If you want the city to look for, your regional infrastructural environment takes care of it. And that regional infrastructure allowed everything to become one. The place of work and the place of dwelling were tied together by the motorway, and they resembled each other. The shopping mall interior resembling the corporate lobby. The same representational forms taking care of all aspects of visual life, if you will. This didn't invade the home. That was still allowed to be evocative of the homestead and the great frontier. But this was a very effective version, that two types of public space, or two types of space, the so-called public space, the mall, and the space of the work were so drawn together. The reality of the fusion of these things as being one environment is made rather explicit by the interesting work of Irish-born American architect called Kevin Roach, among whose buildings were the Ford Foundation and Union Carbide headquarters. But in this proposal for an office building, which is situated in a region, you basically drive to work along a motorway which is owned by your company, park on the roof in this case, and then go down into your office, all which looks at trees and it's in a landscape. Another more sophisticated version of this is indeed the Union Carbide headquarters, which proposes that you get in your car, which is parked in your garage next to your kitchen. You get in it, you drive to work, you take a special exit off the motorway onto another motorway which drives directly into the heart of the building. You get out of your car and you walk to a little enclave of offices which were encouraged to be furnished in any way you wanted them. So you could actually pretend you're going from your kitchen to your study just with a little drive in between. Roach called that the umbilical cord that naturally connects the place of work to the home, but he also acknowledged that they were in fact increasingly becoming one place with just a bit of a physical interlude. He also saw in advance that with communication technology, this distance would be reduced to zero. But I think it's important to not just look at this as a kind of mechanism connecting home to the place of work, but one which conceptually says they are the same place, that they are one environment. And actually other parts of that environment, such as the place to shop, the place to be entertained, are also part of it, that they're in effect one place, one interior. Office buildings radicalize themselves, in a sense. This is also Kevin Roach, the Ford Foundation in New York, to incorporate nature, to encourage people to believe that that nature is still with them, that in fact the region has come into the place of work, that there's not just it's not two interiors which are separated by a motorway, but in fact they're indistinct. And in a sense, this move to include nature in atrium-like forms is akin to that move made earlier at the time of the City Beautiful movement to incorporate landscape parks in the structure of the city in order to legitimate their own urban projects and to make it seem as if the city was just a thing in the landscape and not a kind of beast working away blindly. That in fact it was nature. The city was nature. It was in nature, and nature said that it was okay. More from Kevin Roach, John Deere headquarters, which start to suggest the boundaries between the place of work and nature are very, very limited indeed. In fact, they're kind of one naturalistic work environment. A lobby, the City Bank building in New York by Hugh Stubbins, which takes this to a very interesting level and effectively acknowledges the atrium as not a piece of nature, but a piece of suburb in the middle of the office building, in the middle of the city. And this is a crucial turn in the sense that it kind of turns, it screws up the volume, if you will, to say that the suburb is the legitimate place, the city is a kind of slight embarrassment. This is a piece by Dan Graham. It installed in that lobby, the artist Dan Graham, which had video monitors distributed throughout the public space. So when people were eating their lunch, they would see a film of a suburban house monitored by surveillance cameras to suggest that everything was all right at home. That within this suburban environment, you were safe. Of course, you end up with public spaces like this kind of joke, really, that's quasi-urban, quasi-suburban, quasi-historical, quasi-naturalistic, all aided, of course, by air conditioning, but utterly fantastic. A fantasy which was so convincing that it could be blown up to any scale. This is the West Edmonton Mall in Edmonton, Alberta, a kind of supersized mall, if you will, the largest in the world, I think, I still believe, which contained a series of Crystal Palace vaulted-like spaces which could accommodate any activity, skating rink, wave pool, shops even, a submarine in one pool, and it would be a completely convincing alternative for any idea that you had to go to an urban center. And its American cousin, a very, very interesting model, the Mall of America by John Jerde Partnership, which says that the world is kind of going on underneath the shelter and through the auspices of this overwhelming structure, a structure which is gridded, which in a way suggests the great territorial grid that the whole thing is built on. I think this was an aspect which was even known to Mies van der Rohe, who in his project, and I think in 1953 for a Congress Hall in Chicago, covered this enormous space with a space frame which suggested the vast spaces of the American interior, if you will, and kind of solidified them in this interior for, I think in this case, the Republican Party Congress. These models yielded something which I and perhaps other people have called the continuous interior. I think the spatial typology which is prevalent in our time and which is perhaps the most worrying, it's also the most comfortable, the most beguiling, the most attractive. I talked very briefly at the beginning about my childhood and about Montreal and how there was all this interesting stuff there which helped my feeble little idea, which was to become the thesis of this book, along. And this was the Place Ville-Marie development. It was a three-dimensional urban development which extended underneath many, many blocks, aided by the one building called Place Ville-Marie, which connected infrastructures in terms of train lines and various, took advantage of various contingencies in the landscape in order to create a kind of three-dimensional space, all protected, all underground, sometimes above ground, but protected nevertheless, which protected people from the vagaries of winter and the excessive heat of the summer, a controlled environment, which brought up new types of spaces, such as this, which I found at the time, this was 1963, I think I probably saw it first in 1965, as very exciting, extremely low, absolutely barren in a way, but promising what the whole city of Montreal seemed to promise to me was a kind of freedom of movement, freedom of conceptualization, in a way, freedom for the projective ego. It's interesting that this typology of a continuous linking interior, which takes on all sorts of different buildings and different activities, from concert halls to railway stations to places to shop and places to eat, even plazas, should be brought to its zenith, if you will, by the developments in the design of casinos in Las Vegas. This is Caesar's Palace. You can see Caesar reclining there with a few cards. How things were so simple in those days. But the characteristic of these spaces was their extreme artificiality, extreme interiority, and endlessness. One moved from one place to the next under very, very low ceilings, usually dark. Selected areas of daylight were found in some sort of courtyards, but essentially you were in the grip of a device which led you from one gambling enclave to another. And oddly enough, this kind of primordial movement which resulted was seen as being something akin to nature, a natural movement, which of course the guys who designed shopping centers and so on were very, very keen on to exploit, because this natural movement, of course, could be tied into consumption itself. And it was realized that not only horizontal but complex three-dimensional movement could actually be taken advantage of to shop, so that shopping could be, rather, absolutely everywhere. And that somehow this is what the people wanted, and it was naturalistic. Of course, to me, and perhaps to others, this has a kind of Piranesian nightmarish about it. The characteristic of these engravings, by the way, is not only that they're dark and brooding, but they're spatially so complicated that all the spaces, in fact, become equivalent to each other, precisely the same spatial characteristic that the grid offered. Now the grid is everywhere. And now, while we're on the subject of some place being everywhere, or one thing being like another thing, it seems to me that the mall, the casino, allowed us, or allowed architects, to consider the designs of other spaces which were neither malls or casinos to be precisely like them. In other words, to take advantage of the possibility of continuous movement and the deployment of publicity where necessary. This is IMP's project for Grand Louvre in Paris of the late 80s, which takes on the characteristics at once of mall, sepulchre, airport lobby, corporate lobby, and does this to extraordinary effect, very convincing, as a place just for people to be. And in fact, museums which changed so dramatically, their nature, their funding changed so dramatically, there was new pressure on their forms. They couldn't just be monumental houses for works of art. They had to be something else. They had to communicate in a different way in order to achieve a kind of public popularity and economic efficacy, or efficiency even. And this is the East Wing of the National Gallery in Washington, also by Pei, which takes on precisely the same characteristics of the Louvre that we've seen before. It's technological, it's naturalistic, it's fun, it's exposition-like, it's corporate lobby-like, it's shopping mall-like, and that forms, or those forms together, are understood. It seems that once you get into an urban interior environment which has such patterns of equivalence in them, the next problem becomes how can you organize more of them? And I think that the preeminent motif in the production of urban space is, in fact, the infrastructure. We know that infrastructures are absolutely necessary for the working of complex regional and metropolitan systems, but it seems to me that that infrastructure has been taken on as a motif itself. And the thing about infrastructures, or infrastructural-like spaces, is that they are as unhierarchical as the grid appears to be. They have a logical organization or series of routes which seem to reflect the necessary flow of people. And of course they can be regarded in that sense as kind of natural or naturalistic. But these spaces also have the quality of being able to be exploited, very much like the grid was exploited beforehand, with places to concentrate on shopping, for example, or the fielding of representations. And although these images are all of airports, they're not the airports we would have known from the 1960s as photographed by somebody like Gary Winogrand. No, in fact, they're different types of spaces, in part places for people to get on airplanes, in part places for people to go from one spot to another, in part shopping mall, and in the case of airports like Schiphol, in part so-called public plaza, and even museum. And it's interesting that the representations that find themselves here are inevitably those attached to publicity and the representations of publicity and the kind of cliches which help products along. Even the Crystal Palace makes its appearance in this view, or the nature of Barcelona in this. So we have a condition which is utterly interior, and I think that it is a property, or has become a characteristic of the work of the architectural avant-garde. They have assumed, I suppose, in the making of architecture, that this infrastructural nature, which seems to have burst into being, although it hasn't, it's had a very long history, is in fact a basis for making architectural form, for making places. In fact, the idea of an architecture being like infrastructure is very much like the idea of the grid, which Jefferson devised. It's a projective device which eliminates places, eliminates specificity, and eliminates otherness. Now, I'm very interested in the work of Koolhaas in this context, and this lecture will be ending quite soon, so you'll be able to stretch your legs. But Koolhaas seems to have a critical view of this world, which I've been describing briefly, and wants to make an architecture which has a critical relationship to it. In other words, where adjacencies, their antagonisms, are kind of viewed, that you become conscious of them, that you become conscious that they're next to each other, and you become conscious how the city is actually structured. He is very excited about the potential of the interior fantasy, which is germane to the American urban experience and the American interior, if you will. I mean, the America is interior. And yet, despite these fascinations, we have an architecture which is essentially an infrastructure which looks at itself in order to sustain itself, which breeds another layer of interiority, which is in fact a self-referential projection, and which I think, in all its hopeful allusions to things like, for example, Cedric Price's Fun Palace, is absolutely antithetical to it. Because whereas Price's work offered a space where people could manifest their desires in any way they wanted, a kind of framework for free activity, unpredictable activity, these choreographed sequences and views and adjacencies and disjunctures are in fact precisely that. They are deterministic, quite the opposite. And in fact, a kind of inward-looking projective representation. I just, to end, recall a few things, 3 images, 3, that's it. The first is Superstudio's project for a continuous monument, and this picture called A Journey from A to B, which cites the whole world can become a kind of projective landscape in which there are people realizing themselves, perhaps hooked up to bits of technology where necessary. There's no hierarchy, there's no city. In a way, the landscape is a sign which exists in what is actually an interior. I think Superstudio made this work as a genuinely critical work, never intending to build it, but to think about in response to the realities of a newly emerging consumer society in Italy, which of course has its own terrible consequences, not only physically, but I suppose ideologically. This image, a photograph of the moon taken on one of the Apollo missions, where you see the tracks of the lunar rover disappearing into a distance. It's interesting that the Americans should go there, send a lot of geologists and photographers to make pictures of the moon precisely like those made of the American West precisely 100 years before. I suppose the characteristic that the astronauts carried away and relayed back to us was that, in fact, the moon was indeed other. But despite the fact that there is an American flag sitting on its surface, it's a very difficult thing to possess. You might possess it in name, but its reality, its complete difference, its inscrutability is impossible to pervade. Which brings us back to the photograph, I believe analogous to this, precisely, that made by Timothy O'Sullivan in a Nevada desert with his own photographic darkroom wagon and horses pictured in the scene in order to give it some scale, in order to put a piece of himself in this landscape which was not himself, other than himself. And in a sense, this attitude, where the other is and exists, despite the projections of the other, I think this is a condition which is germane to European experience, and I think it's a position that we should continue to respect and honor in making the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have some time. Are there any questions?
No. There aren't. That's fine too.
Okay, could I start with one?
All right.
I mean, it seems to me one of the very interesting kind of theoretical implications of what you argue is that obviously you rely on a whole host of historians and theorists who stressed the importance and significance of the grid. I think what's extremely interesting is that to my knowledge, you've absolutely added one dimension to the idea of the grid. It's certainly not there, for example, in Rosalind's account of the grid. It is the idea, in a sense, that the grid, the projection of the grid, creates a kind of interiority. And it seems to me that's actually a very important kind of speculative point. I mean, it doesn't have to be interior, as it were, initially as far as the weather is concerned, but nonetheless, it belongs to a sort of process of interiorization of space, or in your terms, a kind of projection of a grid, which is a kind of interiorization. At several points during the talk, when you actually used the word projection, I was wondering whether, in a sense, your argument hadn't pushed the very idea, traditional idea in architecture of projection, beyond its usefulness. And that in some sense it was becoming its opposite, what you might call kind of introjection or interiorization, as if in a way against what we used to think that architecture was all about, or indeed the representation of space as if you weren't fundamentally describing, maybe from the late 18th century, about the way in which the young American Republic kind of reverses that. And of course, if something like that were true, if as it were, if the revolution, I don't just mean some pointless independence from the British, but if the revolution meant something, without anyone having noticed it, it was about this reversal of projection into interiorization, which would also then, the moment you say introjection, interiorization, it immediately leads to consumption. It is space almost the grid as a form of kind of orality, as a form of consuming things, or as a stress on consumption. And, you know, in that sense, it may not just be anecdotal that your idea of this interiorized space is so appropriate in the domain of consumption. Sorry, I said so. It's not even quite a question.
So I'll provide what might not even be kind of an answer. But I think that what's extraordinary about Jefferson's little doodle on a bit of paper, his system, is that it kind of completes the country in one go. You described it earlier today as kind of a creation of a whole domain without any of the kind of messy bits in between. It enables an idea to exist. It enables certain processes to take place, to be enacted, to be enforced. And, of course, it makes the whole space available at once. My childhood perception, which was that somehow my place, where I was, and some place thousands of miles away, were joined, were one place, in fact, represents that idea, I think, quite succinctly. With regard to this aspect of, or this problem of projection, I get back to the fundamental difference I see between European and American thought in architecture. That the European is concerned with place and specific qualities of occupied place in relation to the world. And the American experience, it's interesting that we go into American films, thinking of John Ford and the final scene from The Searchers, where you look out of the house, the shadows of the porch of the house onto the landscape, which John Wayne walks into, in that kind of swaggering gait. And it's funny that the American house, very Canadian that, sorry. The homestead exists, as a form. There's a plot of land and there are thousands in the middle, but the home in the middle of the homestead, its center is not a space, but is actually the fireplace. Structurally, traditionally, that was it. Everything is outwards from the fireplace. In other words, the interior never really constitutes itself except as something which is always leaving. And that physical idea, related to the mental idea of the fact that I am actually projecting my idea out there so I can control it, possess it, and turn it into me, is what makes the American idea distinctly different. And what is very, very interesting in the development of American architecture is it finally kind of becomes itself and not some copy of European architecture. I mean, we were talking about modernism earlier today, and it seemed to me that modernism in America was always working backwards in relation to the modernism in Europe, which was trying to eliminate history. American modernism was rather more romantic and backward-looking. The time when it actually becomes forward-looking is that when its forms start to resemble its space. And we have the idea of very, very large span structures, for example, repeating themselves in the drawings of the European taught Illinois Institute of Technology. Strangely, it makes finally an American generation of architects. But ultimately, these spaces that are made, as huge as they are, as landscape-like as they are, as inclusive as they are interiors.
I mean, in a way, just to produce a sort of supplementary point, to try to sort of dramatize the point. And I was thinking during the lecture that it seemed to me there were so many possible uses of the concepts which you produced. One might think of it about, in military terms for a moment, because, it's clear and never been more clear than currently in Iraq, leaving aside the political issues, that there is a fundamental difference between the English office class way of analysing territory and the American military way. In a sense, I have no doubt that the English way is, in some sense, more what you might call traditional. It's sort of cartographic and topographical, and not that different from something like the Second World War. And therefore, there's a fundamental inability of English officers to understand the strategic and tactical calculations of American trained officers, whose relation to external space is much more what you might call the perceiving of external space as a resistance on the part of that externality to being interiorized.
Yes.
Not so much captured in a medieval sense, or even destroyed in a First World War sense, but somehow interiorized and administratively represented then as ours. And it struck me that your distinction, about space, was not only incredibly valuable in terms of differentiating a European and American experience at an architectural and urban level, but really, might be pushed even further. And in a sense, it might show us both what the radicalism of the American Revolution was, and why there's still a little bit of time to spot it.
I think that's very, very well put.
Sorry, please, questions?
I think exhaustion is setting in.
This is the first
Profound sense of
lecture,
interiority.
so you do not come to an interesting lecture and fail to ask questions.
We're overwhelmed.
I can see several people on the verge.
Well, there's one here. There's a question here for Colin.
You started with a very evocative picture of Savannah, Newtown,
Hmm.
and this was the first moment when you talked about the tension between what is known and what is unknown, between what is familiar and what is other. And I was very convinced by the whole series of choices, illustrations that you gave of this spread of the non-stop city, of the ubiquitous spread of the interior space outside. On the other hand, I can't stop being haunted by your image of Yosemite, which you put there for a very good reason. And it's not because Yosemite is just a myth. It's because in America, the nature of the undomesticated, uninteriorized space is still there. In my experience in America is that it still is able to maintain that extraordinary tension between the spread of the grid and in all its forms
Mm-hmm.
and the presence of nature. So in a sense, I'm more aware of non-stop city in many parts of Europe than I am in America. America still seems to be able to feed its frenzy for growing that carpet of development, because it has that reservoir of singularity, that reservoir of sublime, which you mentioned. And I just wonder, because the lecture is balanced in the imbalanced sense, in favor, against Yosemite or away from
No, I like Yosemite very much. I think it's very nice.
Your own perception is of this relation
Well, you know, almost as soon as a desire for Americans to move took place, writers in the United States were bemoaning the fact that nature was being ruined, raped. Thomas Cole talks about the Adirondacks being completely demolished by a mindless destruction, exploitation for logging, mining, etc., which of course was one of the fundamental reasons why people wanted to go westward. The government paid for countless surveys in order to find out what was out there that could be exploited. And in fact, the funding, or part funding, of the railway lines through the United States was that it realized, the US government realized, that for cities to survive as industrialized entities, they needed raw materials. And nature was to provide that rather than beauty. I think, of course, America being a depositing spot for utopians was a place for evangelicals as well. And Yosemite and other places of great beauty were seen as God's work, which in this territory legitimated our project of existence, if you will, and of freedom, religious freedom, personal freedom, so on. I think right from the start, right from the discovery of Yosemite, if you will, which was sort of discovered by people like John Fremont, who was the great kind of propagandist, politician, explorer, speculator. He had a huge mine next to Yosemite. And it was actually only after extremely hard petitioning by Homestead and others that it was protected at all. It could have been just taken away very, very easily. But I think their work, and the work of the photographs of Watkins, mythologized this evidently extremely beautiful and singular landscape. And the aspect of myth which pervades the entire American project of occupying its own territory, that is the part which is indelible. That is the part. I know nature still exists in big clumps, and there are national parks to protect it now. But in a way, it's the story of those parts which is underpinning the entire project, which allows the suburbs to, despite their banality, continue to be seen as little paradises, So I'm not anti-Yosemite. But what I am concerned about, or interested in, let's put it that way, is the American urban project's ability to take certain representations in order to fortify its position. And the sublime that the American West offered is one of those pieces, one of the pieces of the puzzle.